This season of the Creative Piano Teaching Podcast is proudly supported by My Music Staff.
With a digital, one of the things that I would recommend is that, like a chess player reflexively at the end of their turn hits the chess clock without even thinking, is that with the digital piano there, every time the student's about to play, they hit record just before they play. And so the workflow, instead of it becoming the student does something and then the teacher talks about it, and we both hope we're talking about the same thing, except we're not, the student plays something, and then the student and the teacher together relive exactly what they've played. And they can play it back as many times as they like. And it's all happening in present tense. And then they're sitting on the same side of the desk troubleshooting.
Welcome to the Creative Piano Teaching Podcast, the place where teachers from around the world meet to share innovative ideas about music education. Listen and learn as we help you motivate your students, grow your income, expand your studio, and become a more creative piano teacher.
G'day everyone, it's Tim Topham here. Welcome back to Season 2, 2018 of the Creative Piano Teaching Podcast. We're almost at the end of Season 2. I can't believe how quickly it seems to have gone. This is episode number 131, and a very special welcome to all my Inner Circle members. Whether you are listening for the first time or you've tuned in for a long time, thank you very much for choosing to spend today with me. I'm committed to providing you lots of value for your studio, for your students, for you, and your own personal development and studio growth. If you're a long-time listener and you haven't left me a Facebook review or an iTunes review, I really would value you doing that if you do have a spare couple of minutes. It's a very quick process and it means a lot to me, and I very much appreciate them, and I read every review that I get. You can head to timtopham.com/review to find out just how easy it is. Today's show notes and full transcript are now available at timtopham.com/episode 131. So today we're going to do things a little bit differently. We're going to unpack with my guest a number of statements, some may call them heresies or perhaps unmentionables, and discuss together some thoughts on them. Some will be controversial, some might be a little bit funny, but either way, I hope these challenge your thinking and encourage you to look at your teaching from a slightly different perspective. And just before we begin, I will say that my guest today is a fast talker, and he's also an Aussie. It probably explains how he's been able to write so many great books. So if you normally listen to these podcasts at faster speeds, then today is definitely not an episode to try that with. I don't think you're going to be able to catch too much. And by the way, speeding up your listening is a great productivity hack if you haven't found out about it already and you're a bit limited for time. And you can easily shift the playback speed if you're listening to these podcasts on my app. To download the app, again, just head to your app store and search for Tim Topham. My guest today is one of music education's best-known writers and lateral thinkers. He's recorded for Warner Music as a pianist and composed for Alfred's, the AMEB, and Trinity College. To make sure he doesn't spend his whole day sitting at a keyboard, he holds black belts in 3 different martial arts and runs Australia's largest school-based martial arts program. You can preview his recordings and books, including The Practice Revolution, Dynamic Studio, Practiceopedia, and Scales Bootcamp at philipjohnston.studio. So welcome to the show, Philip Johnston.
Hi there, Tim. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Great to have you here, and I can't actually believe it's taken so long for me to invite you formally on to have a chat, because you have actually had a massive impact on me. I actually this book I managed to find in my bookcase. It's The Practice Revolution, and I know that you're well known for your books, perhaps even more known for your books outside of Australia than inside of Australia. But this one had a really big impact on me, and it was a very simple concept. And I wonder if other people have fed this back to you about the difference between asking kids to practice for time versus for outcomes. And that was just a really simple thing that came out at the right time for me. Have you got good feedback about that book?
Look, I still get some mixed feedback about that, in that there are some people who still feel very strongly that time is the thing.
Right.
And that the best benchmark, we'll talk about this later in the podcast today, in fact, but the best benchmark for a lesson is that people vote with the number of seconds that they're spending every week. And it's a terrible, terrible way to as a metric for piano lessons. So.
All right, let's dig into that a little bit later. You're obviously well known for many fantastic books, but people probably don't know much more about you. So can you give us a little insight into your day-to-day? What do you spend most of your time doing?
Yeah, this is a little bit confusing, in fact. So I was a piano teacher for 20 years. But if you came into my studio now, you would be monumentally confused because of the mix of things that's here. So I'll just paint a picture for you because I know this is a podcast. People can't actually see where I am right now. So in front of me, there are computer monitors everywhere. And so this is kind of production central for all the various books and websites and mad ideas and whatever else. And it's kind of nerds. Actually, yours would be nerd central as well.
I think we have a similar layout, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So there's lots of techie things happening here. Behind me, there is what looks very much like a large grand piano. It's not a grand piano, by the way, and we'll talk about that coming up in a little while. And there's keyboards everywhere and music stands. So in front of me, it looks like publishing. Behind me, it looks like music. But then on the shelves in the rest of the studio, it's filled with martial arts equipment. So it's uniforms and belts and kick bags and mitts and that sort of thing. And so during the day, I'm busy writing books. In the afternoon and the evenings, I'm actually running a large martial arts school. And the two are not as different as it might actually sound. But certainly the space confuses people when they first come into it. I mean, what is this for? And at school, when the kids get asked the question, so what does Dad do? I don't think my kids got the tiniest idea. I mean, how do you sum that up? It's a bit confusing.
There's definitely, you can tell the martial arts angle influence on your books and your approach to practice and setting challenges and achieving awards and things like that. I imagine much of that has come from the martial arts training and the belts and system like that.
Yeah, it's something that they do very well. Ironically, when I first started doing it, I started back in 1987, and it was because it was as different from music as I could imagine. So I thought, and then quickly discovered that the parallels certainly outweigh the differences. And so, in fact, one of the big parallels that is a challenge for piano teachers and for martial arts instructors is that it's a slow burn. That we take a good decade for a student to get really good at what they're doing. At the end of that decade, they can then end up doing things that the vast majority of the population can't. So anybody who's had 10 years of piano lessons can really play in a way that most people can't. But the question is, how do you get them to stick around long enough to actually get there in an age when everybody is so used to getting good at things really fast, courtesy of computer games where you can load up a golf game or a tennis game or whatever, and then within 45 minutes of playing, you've won the US Open somehow. And of course, we all know reality is not like that. And our students, they're not conscripts; they're volunteers. They get to choose not to be part of the studio anytime they want, and so that's a very real battle in both disciplines.
Right, and it's a battle that would take a number of podcasts to unpack, and perhaps we could do that at one stage. But I imagine one of the simplest approaches is that 10 years is too big a goal, so it's about narrowing those to smaller milestones along the way. Well, that's one approach that could work. And that's, I guess, the approach of martial arts with the belts. It's the approach of music exams with grades. It's trying to find milestones that are smaller and more achievable for students. Leveling
and the
up.
real challenge, in fact, it's not the milestones at that level, which can, so with exams coming along every year, and sometimes gradings for belts can be 6 months or a year apart as well. It's creating additional milestones where you don't have to wait 6 months or a year. I mean, 6 months is a long time to be getting positive reinforcement when you're small.
Right.
So.
And and your books go into more depth on this, particularly, I think, The Dynamic Studio and certainly The Practice Revolution, two books that I'm a big fan of and would recommend any listener check out if they haven't already. We'll make sure there's links in our show notes for today. But out of all your books or resources, have you got one that you're particularly proud of or that you feel has had the most impact?
Look, there's probably two outside. Scales Bootcamp is the one that most people are using. And so that was the very first one where I looked at this idea of gamifying something that is otherwise thoroughly not fun. Everybody has to practice scales, but really nobody's got any idea how to go about it. And so there's something like 3,000 challenges built into that thing. And the promise that has intrigued teachers there is that any student who works their way through that will be an order of magnitude better at their scales than the teacher is. So there's that. But the book that I think I'm proud of is Dynamic Studio.
Dynamic Studio, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. It all came from trying to recreate a feeling I had as a kid. That I don't know if you ever remember, you rearrange your bedroom, and so that the desk that used to be over there is now over here somewhere else, and your bed has been pushed 90 degrees to where it was, and then suddenly everything's new and delicious. Well, it's kind of a fresh start, and it's motivating. And teaching, there's a fair bit of inertia in piano teaching. I think necessarily because we inherit traditions. And this year can feel a little bit like last year as well, particularly if last year was working okay. I mean, why would you change things? I said before that I was teaching for 20 years, but a year that's the same as the next year can very quickly become a decade where things kind of rhyme. We're using the same books. We're teaching the same kind of students. We start teaching at the same time every day, and the piano's been where it's always been. And so having suggested that things could be another way, well, then the pressure on you is to provide such as. And so Dynamic Studio is I think there's 93 different assumptions that we have about lessons that have to be the way they are because they've just always been that way. And then asked, well, what if it wasn't that way? What if it was something? It's a little bit like our topic today, where we're taking things that the teachers would think would be unthinkable otherwise,
right,
and then propose maybe it could be different.
Yeah.
So,
well, let's get into some of our discussion points for today. And it's going to be a little bit different because we're going to unpack a number of statements. You've called them unmentionables. Some may even call them heresies, and discuss together our thoughts on them. And look, I know some of these will be controversial. Some might be a bit funny, but in either way, hopefully, or in any case, hopefully we'll be challenging the thinking of people who are listening and our own as well, I'm sure, as we go along. And it's interesting, actually, that you mentioned the Dynamic Studio because I remember one aspect of that was that each chapter started with a statement. What is there for students to do in your studio would be a question. And, most people would say, well, learn piano, I guess. But you then blow that idea away with idea after idea after idea of the things that could be done in your studio. So we're taking that similar kind of approach with a statement, and then let's unpack it. So should we get going?
Yes. And I'll apologise in advance, because some of these are controversial. And it occurred to me that at the end of today, if this podcast is taken out of context, or heck, even if it's taken in context, it's not just that you might end up with no subscribers, but you'll end up with a few, and they'll all be crazy. So anyway, we'll see how we go.
Now you're worrying me. All right.
Yeah.
So statement number 1, if a piano teacher only has one piano, it should be a digital.
Yeah.
So tell us your thoughts on this, because that would go against the grain in many ways.
Yeah, okay. So, look, I'm saying this fully aware that a lot of piano teachers, if they discover to their horror that their student is working with a digital piano, there's significant pressure to switch to an inverted commas, a real one. And I'm also saying this fully aware of the limitations that much though the brochures might protest otherwise, digital pianos, they don't sound the same and the action's not the same, all those things that we're aware of. I'm not affiliated with any digital piano manufacturers at all, but I've been using them in the studio really since they were first available. And the reason I have been is not the way all the ways they fall short of real pianos. It's the things that they make possible that actually are either very difficult or impossible on acoustic pianos. And in short, that they represent teaching options.
Right. You better unpack that.
Yeah, so I'll give a couple of examples now. So one of the things that they solve is what I call the time travel problem in piano lessons. So if you just bear with me for a second, if you imagine that you're in a grocery store and you're in the car park afterwards and quietly putting groceries away, when a crazy person comes bounding through the car park with a big bag that's filled with rock melons, and they're yelling things that you don't understand, and they're throwing rock melons at some of the windscreens, and they throw it at yours and they break yours and some other ones as well. Okay, and they disappear. And you're being interviewed afterwards about what the heck happened, because I imagine the police are taking an interest in this, and all these questions come at you. How tall are they? What were they wearing? Which way did they run? Which hand did they use to throw the rock melon with? And was the bag have any identifier characteristics on it or whatever? And of course you can't remember. Because it happened a while ago, and with every second that passes, it gets a little more vague and fuzzy. Now, the reason that stupid story is relevant to piano is that the teaching model works very much the same way. So that the student will play something, and then at some point the teacher will stop them, and then we'll make corrections based on what we've just heard. But here's the thing: what we've just heard is now, it's not only in the past, but the student's recollection of that is almost certainly going to be different from the teacher's recollection of that. That's number one. And then number two, the teacher's recollection of it is going to be evolving over time, and so is the student's. And so that if the teacher suggests something such as dynamics possibly being too loud, whether the student can remember that or not, they've kind of now manufactured that part of their ever increasingly fuzzy memory of what just happened. And so the conversation really is very abstract. Now, with a digital, one of the things that I would recommend is that, like a chess player reflexively at the end of their turn hits the chess clock without even thinking, is that with a digital piano there, every time the student's about to play, they hit record just before they play. And you won't always necessarily listen to the recordings, but the point is they're available. And so the workflow, instead of it becoming the student does something and then the teacher talks about it, and we both hope we're talking about the same thing, except we're not. the student plays something, and then the student and the teacher together relive exactly what they've played. And they can play it back as many times as they like, and it's all happening in present tense. And then they're sitting on the same side of the desk troubleshooting this thing.
Right.
And so we can float. Let's talk about pedaling for a second. And instead of trying to rack your brains as to when you were pedaling and who knows, we can actually hear it, and it's right there. So
I totally understand that approach, and I hadn't actually thought about it as an advantage of using a digital piano. So there you go. You're opening my eyes as well, Philip. I think we're lucky if a student even listens sometimes to what they are playing. Certainly for my students, I'll ask them something about what they've just played, and they actually won't be able to give me an answer because they are so focused on concentrating on getting the notes right, or playing it how they think I expect it to be played, or they're stressed about something else. So listening back is always going to be important. But I like the fact that you're saying it actually puts us both on the same page. Let's both listen without any other thing going on to what just happened.
Well, in fact, just taking what you were saying then a little bit further, you identified a problem that whenever a student plays, there's a whole bunch of parameters at play. Things that we could be correcting and things that we couldn't, and you can't pay attention to them all simultaneously. Certainly as a student, you can't. And so at any point in time, the student's playing a guessing game as to what their teacher is going to choose to care about right now. Is it going to be my fingering? Is it this F sharp I keep forgetting? Is it my dynamics, my pedaling, or whatever? Armed with a recording separately, you can actually hear these things one at a time. And so on the very first pass, the only thing we're going to do is that hidden in this passage somewhere, there is a B flat, which I've been circling, okay? And I'm not just circling it because I like it better when you play the B flat. There's a chord in here which has now been completely sabotaged because you're playing a B natural. All right, we're going to play it back. You're going to hear it. It's going to cause you pain, and that's a good thing because we're going to change it hereafter. Okay, then we play that through. We sort the B flat. They've got a more compelling reason than they had before now to get that right. Then we listen to the same recording again, but this time it's not about B flats. I'm going to get the student just to tap along with it because I think the speed's changing, but I'm not going to tell you which way. And so we tap along. And so again, it's exactly the same recording, but now it's the second issue. And so after a dozen different passes of listening to the same recording, you can actually address a dozen different issues, but it's one at a time, which is much more how students like to process this sort of thing. So.
Right. And it will obviously take longer, but it's actually a better learning experience for them too.
Well, this is why I recommend it's an option. You're not going to stop and do this every single time. In fact, just talking about, I'll give you a couple of other options now that are a little more complicated, but open up a completely different way of being able to assess students and get them to hear what they're playing. You were saying before that you've got students who can't hear what they're playing sometimes. What if they could see what they were playing? So if you just take a USB cable and then plug your digital piano into your Mac or your PC, and you're running any sort of digital audio workstation like Logic or Cubase or even GarageBand, composers will then use that to it'll render the notes up on the screen, and then they can have that very quickly color-coded so that if, for example, you're doing an orchestral piece and there's an oboe note which is way too loud, it'll jump out because it'll be bright red. So you can color code, for example, just according to how loud they are. You've done all this sort of thing before.
Right.
But when the student's doing it, then it means when they play it back and we're having a conversation about balance, now we can actually see what maybe the student can't hear. And you can say to them, look, all the things which are loudest will be red, all the stuff which is quiet will be blue, and the things that are in between are kind of purple. Let's have a look at what you just played. And you look there and you can see everything is purple apart from a couple of notes which are blue. Nothing is particularly standing out. And visually, you can see that. Now we listen to it. Where's the tune? We can't hear it either. And so then what you can do is you can take the notes which are not loud enough, and you can then artificially make them louder. You can just change their values. And that takes a second just in the software. It doesn't take long to do. And then what the student gets to hear is a action replay of everything they just did. It's got all their pedaling, it's got all their phrasing and all their articulation. The only thing you've tweaked is it's now got the dynamics that you're hoping they're going to use and the balance that you're hoping they're going to use. And so they now get not an action replay, but kind of like a projection of what this could be if they could fix the balance. And the rest is all in. And so, again, they're listening a little harder now because they've got some ownership over this. It's their thing. And so then the challenge is, let's record it again in a second. We're going to keep what you just did. Then let's look at the colours and see if we can get it looking the same. And so again, it's just a different approach to problems we've been trying to solve for a long time, but it's a new tool for doing it.
Right. And that's very much a next level thing. I wouldn't encourage people to start with that process. Maybe start with Philip's first idea.
It's not that much next level, though, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Because these tools now are designed pretty easy to work with. But yes, it's not out of the box.
Yep. And the first suggestion, just recording everything as it goes, obviously much easier on a digital. And some of them, like my FP7 Roland over here, actually, which I think it was this model. No, actually, it was an N-Sonic keyboard that I used to have. Used to actually automatically record everything that was played, and it would just start a new loop if there was a pause of 5 seconds or something. Really, really handy little. It was a composition designed for composition, so you would never forget an idea that you'd played. Very clever little system. I was just going to say that you could do that on a phone if you were set up right and remembered to press record and things. If you had an acoustic piano, I guess the concept still is the same. Maybe the implementation isn't quite so straightforward.
It's just a little clunkier. Is all.
Yeah. So with regard to the digital pianos, there's obviously plenty of people who may still be concerned about the touch differences and getting students playing on a digital. And I've recorded podcasts about it. I've recorded Facebook Lives about it. But it'd be great to hear it from you as well. What are some of those other advantages you see, and how do you respond to teachers about that touch issue?
Let's talk about the touch thing for a second. I understand the logic behind that. We used to have in the practice room at the School of Music when I was a student, we had old choir uprights that had been beaten to death by generations of piano students, and they're being practiced on kind of 20 hours a day. And the touch on those was astonishingly light, which means that everybody in those practice rooms was lang-lang. There was no problem at all playing the hardest pieces at whatever tempo you wanted. Now, my teacher, by contrast, had I thought it was a shocking piano. He loved it. It was a young Chang, and I'm not saying bad things about young Changs. This was just engineered in a particular way, and it's the heaviest action I've ever seen on any instrument of any sort anywhere in the world, I think. And so the contrast going from one to the other is extraordinary. And so when I hear people talking about digitals not being the same action as acoustics, my reaction is, which acoustic are you talking about? So we already get colossal variation like that. Some of these students who sold their digital piano to get an acoustic are buying a clunky old upright. We're not only the action not the same as the piano in the studio, the notes from note to note doesn't even have the same sort of action. So
yeah, I really worry so much. Well, I'm saddened by teachers who recommend an old or getting a student to buy an upright piano, even if it is 100 years old, and really it's just a piece of furniture, and trying to get them to play on it, because it's going to have the opposite effect to what you really wanted to have, which is to encourage your student to practice. Students will play more on a good instrument.
Well, if their ear is particularly good, it can even mess things up further. So I could, some years ago, I had to do a performance on a piano that all the notes were 3 semitones flat.
Oh.
The whole thing had been tuned down, and apparently there were good reasons. It was something to do with the tension on it. It was not a good piano. The tension on the top strings being such that if it was tuned to concert pitch, the whole thing would be likely to fall apart or something. I didn't know. I didn't accept the explanation. And I couldn't remember any of the pieces. I was just unable to, with it 3 semitones flat, everything just felt, and I don't have perfect pitch, but it just kind of threw.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes having a clunker at home where the octaves are, approximately octaves, but not really, makes things hard and not easy.
And any teachers who are interested in my thoughts on digital pianos and hybrid pianos, we'll put a link in our show notes to a couple of articles that I've written recently about choices for students that we recommend, or that I recommend, I should say. So anything else on that first unmentionable, Philip?
Probably only that one more advantage is the idea of fractaling. Possibly with more advanced students, where you've got things which in multiple lines, you can record all these ideas in one at a time, and so you can end up with a model of a fugue, for example, where the students entered in every subject and has crafted every line as though it was the only thing they were thinking about. And again, you get a picture of the entire piece of them. And again, they're playing every single note. It's not cheating. They're playing the whole thing. And then the challenge is, all right, now with this ideal version that you've created one line at a time, now let's go and see if we can build the real thing.
Right, by playing it, yeah. And of course, you've got it's cheaper to move. It doesn't need tuning. There's plenty of other great advantages as well. Now, a quick word from our sponsor, My Music Staff. My Music Staff is the most popular studio management software available to music teachers around the world. I've even written a blog post on how I personally used My Music Staff to transition to automatic monthly payments. All of my students now receive an automatic invoice each month, and their credit cards are charged instantly. My Music Staff has become an essential part of my own studio, and I've effectively been able to put my entire teaching business on autopilot. One of the great things about My Music Staff is that it scales with your studio. When you start growing your business, it doesn't mean more work for you. From student management to scheduling and billing, it offers you everything you need to manage your business with ease. There's even a student portal that allows students to notify you of any upcoming absences and even reschedule missed lessons without needing your input. It's a great solution for any teacher looking to improve their business and set themselves apart from their competition. Head to mymusicstaff.com to start your 30-day free trial today. Okay, number 2. Daily practice is a bad idea that should just die already.
Yeah. Well, it is. I mean, but there's an extent to which we're playing devil's advocate today, Tim, I think. But this one I'm really not. I think it's a terrible idea. We outlined some of these reasons at the start. Look, the biggest reason I think it's a bad idea and really should die already is that it fails the triage test. I mean, particularly in 2018. I'll explain what I mean by that. Kids now are really, really busy. And the reason they're busy is that our parents really were the first generation of people who were told that they could do or be anything. And then now the kids now are being therefore expected to do and be everything. And we're terrified that, we've got a little Tiger Woods here, except that they won't find that out unless they try golf at some stage. And so they're doing a million different activities. And I heard Samantha Coates actually talking about this in a podcast a couple of weeks ago, I think. Mm-hmm. And I disagree with her conclusions there, where she was saying she wants to interview, and if you're so busy, then maybe you shouldn't be thinking about piano unless you can point to where you can practice. I've got 3 kids. My 2 oldest are at uni, so it's a whole different thing. But I've got one who's still at high school, and he's doing during the week. We've got trumpet choir, we've got debating, we've got not martial arts. Not surprisingly, he's good at maths. So we've got maths extension. There's orienteering. He does cricket. He does drama, and he also loves computer games and whatever else. And for anything to happen every day, and for the requirement to be that it's every day and spend half an hour, it really needs to be in his top 2 or 3. And he's not alone for this to be the case. And if it's not in your top 2 or 3, it's actually an unreal expectation to have. And when that dissonance happens between the teacher's expectation and the fact that it's not in the student's top 2 or 3, the student will quit. We lose students. Mm-hmm. Now, here's the problem with that. My son has a lot of things on that list that he absolutely loves doing that are not in his top 2 or 3. And we all have piano students who love playing piano but really couldn't justify it as the thing that gets 30 minutes of their time every single day. And so I think instead of the battle being about how do we get them to do this every day, the much better question to ask is how do we get them to get the most out of and make this work with the practice that they're able to do. Even if it's only a couple of times a week. And we end up with more students. And then instead of daily practice being something that we think of as being an obligation from the student, it's something as teachers we have to earn because the student will triage, don't forget. So our job is not to get them to practice every day. Our job is to get them to their top 2 or 3.
Right.
And if we get them to their top 2 or 3, the daily practice actually then takes care of itself because they become more ambitious about what they want to play. They become excited about harder pieces, and then we can sell that. We can say, well, yes, of course you can play the third movement of this. It sounds cooler than the other 2. You can't do that on 2 days a week. So, and that's when you can talk about dialing up the practice. And again, they're volunteers and not conscripts at that point.
Yeah, this aligns really well with the podcast discussion I had 2 episodes ago with Danny Thompson about practice and why practice can be killing your studio. It's exactly that same approach in that, particularly at the beginning, the expectation that if students don't practice, then parents will pull them from lessons, doesn't align very well with any of our views, parents or teachers, on the goals of giving a student an introduction to music, which is that they build their esteem and they have fun and they build a love of music and all this kind of stuff. Yes. And so we were just literally talking about exactly the same thing. And the goal for teachers is not to expect practice, but to nurture a love that students want to practice and want to, as you say, put it into their top 3.
Yeah, and I think part of the problem here is that I've said before, and for goodness sake, don't quote this out of context, but music teachers are exactly the people on the planet who should not be teaching music. And what I mean by that, particularly in this context, is that we often have the same expectations of our students that people had of us and our teachers had of us. But what we're forgetting is we're piano teachers now. We were the students who were really good. and pretty serious about it. So, of course, we had expectations of daily practice. So one of the problems with this being the same for everybody, this one-size-fits-all approach, is that we get a huge range of different students. And if I'm coaching basketball and not teaching piano, and I've got one student who just likes to play, and then I've got another student who has got serious dreams of being drafted one day, then obviously I'm going to be recommending different practice regimes. And that second student, they're kidding themselves unless they're practicing every day. All right. So if I've got a student who's actively preparing for the Chopin piano competition and they're practicing a couple of times a week, then we've got a major problem. But for the vast majority of students, none of the other activities that they're doing have this expectation, number one. And
Correct.
number two, you can end up getting very good at these other activities, even without the daily practice. And number three, if you do become passionate about it, you'll practice daily anyway. It'll just happen. So with my martial arts students, I love the idea that they're working at home behind the scenes. I know that there are some who do. I'm under no illusions that all of them do, and I don't have expectations that they will. The really, really good students, of course, are pushing harder behind the scenes, but I don't have to twist their arm to do it.
That's right.
No pun intended.
I just got it. And I see my nephew. One of my nephews is he's going to be a sportsman. I think he has got a good chance to be a pro sportsman. And literally, he spends all his time kicking balls around, shooting hoops, anything, any time of the day. If he's got a ball in his hand that he's playing around with and practicing something, he's a happy guy. And that's just an absolute love of that activity. And he is practicing without any need from his coach to actually practice. And I think it's exactly the same with piano. If we can engender that love, then our kids will hopefully want to go to the piano and have a bit of a tinker and try this out, and then maybe jump on YouTube and try and learn something that they're being shown, and then that will hopefully grow. So I'm with you on this one.
Tim, I really think our only job is to fire them up. And if you get a student fired up, everything else is possible from there. Everything else is easy from there.
So let's go on to our next one, Philip. It's a little bit controversial again, and it sounds a bit odd, but here it is. Piano teachers are better off playing computer games than doing pedagogy courses. Tell us about this one.
Well, and again, that sounds like I'm saying terrible things about pedagogy courses, and I'm really not. I'm actually saying good things about computer games. Can I give you a bit of a backstory for all this, Tim?
Mm-hmm.
And explains lots of my books and a lot of my thinking with piano practice in the first place. When I was a kid, there were Game & Watches with these little handheld devices that everybody at school had. You could play Donkey Kong and whatever on them. Everybody except me. I didn't have one. And my father was heading overseas, and I knew he was going through a duty-free store, which means he could bring me back one of these things. And so he came back, and at the end of that, I still didn't have one, and everybody else did, but I was the only person who now had a computer. And his argument was that you're very welcome to play games, but you need to design them and you need to code them yourself. And so I've been interested in that ever since. And fast forwarding now, with kids of my own, and anybody who has ever tried to call people away from a computer game to come and have dinner will know exactly what I'm talking about, how difficult that is. Anybody who's tried to call somebody away from piano practice to have dinner gets an entirely different experience. And one of the things that I started to get interested in is why. What is it about gaming that makes it so compelling? And it's not the spaceships and the dinosaurs and the explosions in the end, because sometimes people can be hooked doing thoroughly boring things. There's a game called World of Warcraft, which most people would be familiar with, and there's an activity in that game where all you're doing is fishing.
Right.
Pushing the same over and over and over again. It's significantly less interesting than practicing scales, but they've wrapped it in such a leveling up system that you're never more than 4 or 5 minutes away from a reward of some sort, and so it becomes absolutely compelling and addictive. And none of this is accidental. So game designers have got very, very good at wrapping content that is not always interesting in of itself, but then making it impossible to stop. And that they'll use behavioural economists and psychologists. And there's been studies which have said that the level of addiction with some computer games matches that of street-level heroin.
Whoa.
Now, I'm not recommending that we get practice to that point, but it is interesting to have a look at some of the things that they're doing that maybe we're not, and emulating them. So I'll give you a couple of examples right now. One of the things that gaming does well, that we don't at all really, is making sure that students are always very, very clear on what to do next. Mm-hmm. Your next step is always laid out. So we send students home with a big picture thing to do. I want to hear this page of the sonatine the next week. All right.
Yep.
And then all the next steps fall entirely to the student. But of course, students don't arrive knowing how to do all of that sort of project management stuff. And so games do that for you. They give little quests that then break this big task down into lots of little tasks. And then one task at a time, they can actually get you to complete some quite sophisticated and long-term challenges, sometimes challenges that will take you months or even years to complete in some of these computer games. And as part of completing these steps, they always make sure that you are very, very clear on what finished looks like.
Right.
That's a missing thing. So as teachers, the verb we use is improve or tighten or tidy up. But how do you know when to stop?
Right.
So it's kind of the gaming equivalent of being sent out into a forest to just kind of gather things. Whereas a game would tell you what we need is we need 23 exactly, and they've got to be green berries, and here's where you're going to find them. And as soon as you get 23, you come back and there's your reward straight away.
Right.
And the best way to understand all of this is not to listen to people like me rant about it. It's actually to choose some of the more popular games and play them. And you'll experience it for yourself and ask it why it is that you're having trouble at 2 a.m. being torn away from this.
So it makes perfect sense what you're saying, but how does that actually look in a lesson? Can you give us some examples?
Well, I can give you an example now. Another element that games use is that they make extensive use of leaderboards, not just so that people can be competitive, but so you can always see what's just ahead of you. So anything that can be measured is measured. And so there's metrics for just about everything, and that means then you've got lots of different ways that you can encourage students. So going back to what we were talking about before, we were looking at the idea of students practicing every day and that possibly not being the best idea. Something else that you might be able to measure instead is that we might be looking at the number of bars that they come in with each week that are brand new. And then it's a number you can attach to that. 25 this week, 31 the week before. And then every student in the studio, of course, has got numbers of their own. With that, you've got leaderboards, you've got competitions, and you've got ways of being able to compare what students are doing now with what they were doing a week ago.
Right. So trying to put numerical values on things, if possible, helps in ranking and seeing progress.
Yeah, and setting goals.
Right.
So that instead of asking them to prepare the development section, we're talking about exactly how many measures, number one, and then what do we regard as being successful there?
Right.
I mean, if they can stumble through it from beginning to end, or do we expect that it's from memory at a particular tempo? Is it two hands together or is it separate? And so these are instructions that we will sometimes give casually in any case. It's not like it's completely open-ended. My argument is that it's not specific enough, though, and that the more you leave to the student, the less right we've got to be upset with what they produce.
Right.
And so if we want to steer them in a particular way, break down all the stuff you're hoping to do, the process they're hoping to follow, into a series of steps, and they tick those off as they go. And that's what inspired the whole bootcamp idea. And it was really born out of a frustration that I had to create these steps for my students myself. And it just would have been easier if it was kind of there to start with.
It all comes back to another element of music education, which is that pieces are never really finished. You can always go back to a teacher playing a piece and there'll always be new things. We very seldom ever say, you know what? You have completely nailed that piece. That is perfect and you don't need to do anything else on it. Because it's almost as if we haven't done our job right, if we haven't picked more fault.
I think it's where we've got to make a distinction between perfecting something and closure.
Right.
And we've got to be more comfortable with closure long before anything is looking perfected. But that means that at some point somebody has to say out loud what it is that we're chasing for us to rule a line under this. And that can be simple as that the whole reason that we're doing this particular work by Scriabin in the first place is because it's exactly the sort of thing that the student finds difficult to memorize because the harmonic shifts and whatever else.
Right.
And so the only reason we're doing this is for you to be able to play this from beginning all the way through to the end without the score. And we're not trying to win all the other battles that we could be winning Scriabin. That's not why we're doing this piece right now. And on the day the student can do that, and of course the piece is imperfect, they can definitely play it better, we've kind of won that battle and we move on.
Yeah, nice. I totally get the idea, and I seem to remember you have discussed this in more detail in your, I think, either the Practice Revolution and or Dynamic Studio. Would I be right?
I think you're probably right in both.
Yeah,
somewhere.
yeah. So if you're interested and you're listening to this about this idea of challenges and really imaginative, creative challenges for your studio, not just the 40-piece challenge, which is a great challenge, and many teachers will be aware of it. Philip has come up with a whole lot more, including sight reading challenges and challenges around all sorts of different things, and you give great names to them. That's what I remember the most too. So do check out those two books if that has been an interesting and a controversial topic for you. Anything else on that one before we move on to your next one?
No, I think me talking about gaming, people's eyes can glaze over pretty quickly if they don't actually game themselves. So the only takeaway from all of this is that if you are a teacher in 2018, the students you are working with are gaming. I promise you, the vast majority of them are.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll be a much more effective teacher if you are familiar with what's driving them when they're playing those games, and they are being driven.
Right. Yep. Sounds good. Yep. Okay. Next one is the following: piano students shouldn't be allowed to use any sheet music until they've had 2 years of lessons.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, that's not a book title anywhere, is it? I don't think that's conventional.
I don't think that doesn't really roll off the tongue anyway. But I do. I mean, obviously, this aligns very well with my own thinking because I've created my own resource for teachers about how to teach beginner students with no books, and I'm very passionate about it. So tell me about your thinking behind this.
Right, well, you'll be pleased to hear about this. But look, we're probably on the same wavelength here in that teaching is mostly about ignoring things, not fixing things. It's so that when a student plays something for you, there'll be 50 different things that we could actually correct, but right now we're only going to talk about one of them. So the question is, what are the 49 we didn't talk about, and how do you triage that?
Mm-hmm.
And if you come right back to the beginner level, the world of what they've got to learn before they become proficient is absolutely enormous. And as teachers, we're free to teach that in any order we like. And so the question is, what's the best order to be teaching it in? Now, traditionally, reading has been one of the very, very first expectations, and it may well work with some students, but we've all experienced plenty of other students where it doesn't. The problem is, if that's the way you operate and it's not working, that's game over at that point.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of students where it doesn't work that way. So their short dose of music lessons, they kind of get inoculated against the idea of music lessons for the rest of their lives, because it could well be at school that one of the things they really struggle with is reading, and suddenly here we are again. All they want to do is play the piano. And we're 6 lessons into this, and we're trying to decode whether the second line up is a G, except hang on a second note, it's a B, because it depends whether it's treble or bass clef.
Right.
So, and all they want to do is they signed up for this because there's a Taylor Swift piece they want to play. So, there's a disconnect there. And so my argument would be to bump that down the road a little bit, to actually get them playing a lot and getting comfortable with keyboard geography long before we're actually looking at what that looks like, so that by the time they are looking at it, they've got something to relate it to.
Definitely, 100% aligned with my thinking, and I think in that amount of time, not just playing, but listening and creating and tapping and singing and all of those musical activities that are so vital for students. And it comes back to that approach of music being a language and relating language acquisition to musical acquisition. And how do we do it? We don't start reading first, we start talking first and listening. In fact, listening first. So I think you're right on the money with that one.
Well, and I think also because the vocab is so much bigger than that. I mean, traditionally, what do? We start on middle C, and I'm still not clear on why that's the case. And then so all the pieces that the student's learning to play at the beginning are, however interesting you can make a middle C. And the answer to that question is not very interesting. Whereas if instead they were given a pentatonic scale just using the black notes, and they were making up their own little pieces, and it didn't matter which black note they were playing because it all works. Or they were given that same middle C, but what they're doing is they're riffing over a kind of a blues accompaniment. Then they're making music in their very first lesson instead of dealing with abstractions in their very first lesson.
Yep, absolutely. It can only be a good thing. Whether 2 years is the right metric, I'm not sure, but I think we've given that as a controversial statement as much as anything. But maybe, I don't know, if you taught up to that length of time when you were teaching.
Can I give you? I'll go further than that.
Yeah.
I didn't start learning piano until I was in year 7, so it was really late at the start of year 7.
So that's 12, 13-year-old?
Yeah, 12, around about there. And things moved really fast. By the time I was halfway through year 9, I'd played my first concerto with the local youth orchestra.
Wow.
So that's quick progress. And so, of course, I got into the local conservatorium, but I couldn't read music when I did.
Right. So you learned a whole concerto by ear?
Pretty much by ear, and then kind of slogging through the notes where I really couldn't figure out what was happening. But it was really from recordings, because I was working at most. So I'm aware that there's other ways of getting things done. That's number one. And then number two, I had some piano students where worked with them, started when they were in year 2, still working with them when they were 17 or 18, and we didn't use any books in that time at all.
Whoa.
I mean, at all. We were just doing composition and improvisation, and she could really play and could really make up her own pieces at the end of it, but had no interest and probably no skills in being able to sit down and play a cooler piano sonatina. But it can also add no interest in doing it.
Well, that's potentially a heresy of its own, that you would teach a whole student for their whole career with no music. I totally understand, and it's got to be about the benefit. Well, not the benefits, the goals of the student in conjunction with their parent, obviously when they're young too. And I think one of the greatest issues with teaching in that way is that that would be outside a lot of teachers' comfort zones, and there's not nearly as many resources for teachers who would like to take that approach, even if they have a student that they think it would be beneficial for, because we have reading and method books as such a crutch, I guess, in many ways.
Tim, if only there was an Australian creator with his own podcast who was creating resources for people who want to teach improvisation.
Exactly right. Thanks for the plug, Philip. I appreciate it. So look, I'm going to start wrapping things up. I could easily talk to you for a very long time, and I think listeners would love to hear more of these, and I'm sure we could come up with many more of these kind of controversial statements. Why don't we see what the feedback's like from this episode, and then perhaps think about getting you back for another one.
Very happy to.
Oh, that sounds great. So you're a project man. I'm sure you're working on something behind the scenes. It's all very secretive. Can you give us a bit of a little sneak peek into what you're working on at the moment? My creations are always born out of the frustration that things I want to use when I'm teaching don't exist. And I'm now gently starting to get into the repertoire side of things. So having written so much now about how students should be working behind the scenes, I'm now getting very interested in what it is that they're working with. And so that's the shift now. Right. Okay. So something to do with repertoire. You mean your own compositions or approaches to repertoire that's out there?
Yes.
Right. Great.
So toe in the water for that was the mad Chopsticks Infinity thing. Well, we got a version of that coming up in Canada. I can't say too much about it at the moment. Halfway through this year, where I think it's going to be pretty much a Guinness record attempt with the better part of 100 people all playing the piano at the same time.
Right.
But anyway, so Chopsticks Infinity was designed to be sort of as many parts as you can fit on as many pianos as you can, and it doesn't matter which bits you select from the book; they all kind of fit together.
Right. Okay.
So of that sort of ilk.
That was one of your compositions, was it?
Well, no. I mean,
arrangements.
We've all done variations on Chopsticks before, but there's 100 of them in there, and the plan is that beginner students can play in exactly the same duet or trio or quartet or whatever the heck as the most advanced students in the studio, because there's easy parts and there's difficult parts as well.
Got it.
There's a studio. So.
Right. And I have to say thank you very much for allowing me to put one of your pieces in the AMEB Piano for Leisure 4 books. Your Micro Waltz has been incredibly well received, and it's always one that I perform for teachers when I'm going through the books, just because I love playing it, and teachers absolutely adore it. So thank you.
All right. No, thanks for the chance.
So what's the one big thing you'd most like teachers to take away from today's discussion?
I think it would be that whatever the single most exciting difference that you could possibly make to your studio is, it's probably something you haven't even contemplated yet. That's number one. And that number two, that will always be true, even if you're contemplating exciting things. And so the idea that your podcast series, for example, exists is exactly the sort of thing that teachers should be doing, so that it's a little insular otherwise, and we can get locked into our studios doing our own thing, and it can work pretty well, but it can work spectacularly well when you are shamelessly stealing the ideas of thousands of other teachers,
right?
Which is what you're setting up. So this is a big thank you, Tim, on behalf of all the people who are depending on the stuff that you put out. It really does make a difference. Because we have been islands for a long time, and you are a potent force for bringing things together.
Oh, much appreciated, Philip. And you've summarised very nicely what my whole goal for this podcast was all about. So thank you. Appreciate it. And thanks for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to a future one.
Okay. Thanks, Tim.
Well, I really hope you enjoyed today's interview with Philip Johnston. He's probably better known in the United States, actually, for the books and resources that he's created for piano teachers than he is here in his own country of Australia. But I do hope that changes because, as you can tell, he's definitely a lateral thinker and he's got some phenomenal ideas that really challenge the status quo and make us all think more about the teaching that we're doing. So next week on the podcast is actually the last episode for season 2. I'm a bit sad, actually. It has been so much fun putting this season together for you, and I can't wait to share this last episode with you, which is, again, a little bit different. Lots of teachers in my community are starting to branch out of teaching and looking into ways that they can run their own online enterprises on the side, building courses or creating virtual studios, selling products, whatever it is. There's lots of options for doing that now, and it's going to be great because next week I'm going to actually share a coaching session I gave to one of my members, Jenna Carlson, who's actually been on the podcast before, you may remember, in season 1. And we're going to be sharing some tips about building her online presence and launching a new web development business for music studio owners. It's a fascinating look inside the creation of a totally new business enterprise and unpacks the kinds of opportunities that are available for mentoring to members in my inner circle. I'm Tim Topham, and this is the Creative Piano Teaching Podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next week.
Ladies and gentlemen, that will conclude this evening's entertainment.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Creative Piano Teaching Podcast. We'd love to help take your teaching to the next level as a member of our supportive community. Use the coupon Piano Podcast for $100 off an annual membership of Tim's Inner Circle today. To find out more, head to timtopham.com/community.